The valley stretches before them like a corridor to hell. 673 men on horseback stare down a mile and a quarter of open ground. Russian cannons line both ridges. 12 artillery pieces wait at the far end, their crews already loading grape shot. Every officer in the Light Brigade knows what this order means. They know they are about to ride into a crossfire from 3 directions. They know most of them will never return. And yet, when the bugle sounds, they go. Captain Lewis Nolan, the man who delivered the fatal order, gallops ahead of the formation, waving his sword, screaming something no one can hear over the thunder of hooves. Moments later, a shell fragment tears through his chest. His sword arm freezes in the air. His horse carries his corpse forward, a dead man leading the living into annihilation. This is the charge of the Light Brigade. This is the Battle of Balaclava. This is the story of how miscommunication, ego, and the rigid class structure of the British Army sent some of the finest cavalry in the world charging directly into the mouths of Russian guns. It is a story of catastrophic failure at the highest levels of command. It is also a story of almost incomprehensible courage from the men who followed orders they knew were suicidal. On the 25th of October, 1854, in a remote Crimean valley, the British cavalry wrote their names into history with their own blood. What happened that morning would become the most famous military disaster in British history, immortalized in poetry, debated by historians, and mourned by a nation. But the full story, the chaos, the heroism, the stupidity, and the slaughter is far more complex than any poem could capture. To understand Balaclava, we must first understand why British soldiers were dying on a peninsula in the Black Sea, thousands of miles from home, in a war most of them barely understood. The Crimean War began as a dispute over religious rights in the Holy Land. Orthodox Russia and Catholic France both claimed the right to protect Christian sites in Ottoman-controlled Jerusalem. It sounds almost absurd, a war over church keys, but beneath this religious squabble lay the great power politics of 19th century Europe. Russia wanted to expand southward, to control the straits connecting the Black Sea to the Mediterranean, to position itself as the protector of Orthodox Christians throughout the crumbling Ottoman Empire. Britain and France saw this as an existential threat to the balance of power. If Russia swallowed the Ottoman Empire, it would dominate the eastern Mediterranean and threaten British routes to India. So, in March of 1854, Britain and France declared war on Russia. The Ottoman Empire, already at war with Russia since the previous year, became their ally. It was a coalition of convenience, 3 powers with different interests united against a common threat. By September, an allied force of some 60,000 men, British, French, and Ottoman, had landed on the Crimean Peninsula with one objective: capture the Russian naval base at Sevastopol. The invasion began well enough. On the 20th of September, the Allies won a bloody victory at the Battle of the Alma, driving the Russians from strong defensive positions overlooking the river. The road to Sevastopol lay open, but instead of pressing their advantage, the Allied commanders hesitated. They decided to march around Sevastopol and approach from the south, establishing a supply base at the small port of Balaclava. This decision would prove fateful. Balaclava was a tiny harbor, barely adequate for the massive logistical demands of a besieging army. The single road from the port to the siege lines became a river of mud as autumn rains began. Supplies piled up on the docks while men at the front went hungry, and the position itself was dangerously exposed. The harbor sat at the end of a series of valleys, protected only by a thin screen of Ottoman and British troops manning a line of small earthwork fortifications called redoubts. The Russians saw the vulnerability. By mid-October, they had assembled a force of some 25,000 men under General Pavel Liprandi, positioned in the hills north of Balaclava. Their objective was simple: break through the Allied defenses, capture the port, and cut the British army off from its supplies. The stage was set for disaster. Dawn breaks cold and grey over the Crimean hills. A thick mist clings to the valleys, obscuring the Russian positions. In the British camps, men stir from fitful sleep, their breath visible in the chill air. The smell of wood smoke mixes with the ever-present stench of inadequate sanitation. Horses stamp and snort in their lines, sensing something in the air. At approximately 5:30 in the morning, the first Russian guns open fire on the easternmost redoubt. Redoubt number 1, held by 500 Ottoman soldiers, Tunisian colonials, pressed into service far from home. These men have been poorly supplied for weeks, denied rations that accord with their Muslim faith, given minimal training, and now they face the full weight of a Russian assault. 5 battalions of infantry and 30 cannons bear down on their position. They are outnumbered 10 to 1. No British reinforcements are coming. Lord Raglan, the British commander-in-chief, receives the news at his headquarters on the Sapune Heights, a ridge overlooking the entire battlefield. From this elevated position, Raglan can see the whole tactical situation spread out before him like a map. He watches as Russian infantry, some 25 battalions strong, advance on the Ottoman redoubts. He sees the puffs of smoke from the artillery exchanges. He has, in effect, a god's-eye view of the battle. This perspective will prove both blessing and curse. Raglan can see everything, but he cannot feel the chaos, the noise, the confusion that engulfs the men in the valleys below. His orders, issued from this Olympian height, will assume a clarity of vision that simply does not exist at ground level. The Ottoman defenders of Redoubt number 1 fight with desperate courage. For 90 minutes they hold their ground, pouring rifle and cannon fire into the advancing Russian masses. They are allies of the British Empire, yet no British troops move to support them. No reinforcements arrive. By 7:30, 170 of the 500 defenders lie dead or wounded, a casualty rate of over 30%. Only then does the position fall. The survivors retreat toward Balaclava, and the Russians turn their captured guns on Redoubt number 2. The garrisons of the remaining redoubts, watching 8 Russian battalions approach with cavalry and artillery support, recognize the hopelessness of their situation. They have seen what happened to their comrades. They have seen that no help is coming. They withdraw. British observers will later criticize this retreat, conveniently forgetting that they sent no assistance to men who had already paid in blood for time the British desperately needed. As the redoubts fall, the surviving Ottoman soldiers stream toward Balaclava. Some are wounded. Some have lost their weapons in the brutal hand-to-hand fighting. British accounts will later mock these men as cowards, but the truth is simpler and uglier. They were abandoned. They held their positions for 90 minutes against overwhelming force, bought precious time for the British to organize their defense, and received nothing in return. Now, Russian cavalry, sensing victory, begin to pursue the retreating men. If they can break through to the port, the entire British position in Crimea could unravel. Standing between the Russian cavalry and Balaclava is a single infantry regiment, the 93rd Highlanders, commanded by Sir Colin Campbell. They number approximately 550 men. They are all that stands between 400 Russian hussars and the British supply base. Campbell has no time to form his men into the traditional infantry square, the standard defensive formation against cavalry. Instead, he deploys them in a line just 2 ranks deep, a formation so thin it seems suicidal. Convention demanded 4 ranks at minimum. Campbell gives them 2. The Highlanders stand on a slight rise near the village of Kadikoy. They can see the Russian cavalry forming up in the distance, the morning sun glinting off sabers and lance points. The ground trembles with the vibration of hooves. The smell of gunpowder already hangs in the air from the morning's fighting. A young private turns to the veteran sergeant beside him, his voice tight with fear.
Sergeant, there's hundreds of them. Why aren't we forming square?
Because Sir Colin says we stand in line, and Sir Colin hasn't been wrong yet. You keep your eyes front, and your finger on that trigger.
But if they break through,
They won't break through. You see those men beside you? They're Highlanders, same as you, same as your father was. We don't run, we don't break. We stand, we fire, and we send those Russian bastards back to hell. Now shut your mouth and steady yourself.
Campbell rides along the line, his voice carrying over the nervous murmur of his men. He does not offer false comfort, he offers something better, clarity. "There is no retreat from here, men," he calls out. "You must die where you stand." The Highlanders grip their Minier rifles tighter. These are not the old smoothbore muskets of their father's generation. These are rifled weapons, accurate to several hundred yards, capable of stopping a cavalry charge before it reaches the line. If the men hold their nerve, if they fire in disciplined volleys, if they do not break. The Russian cavalry begins its advance. The thunder of hooves grows louder. The Highlanders can see individual faces now, mustaches, grimaces, the flash of raised sabers. The distance closes. 400 yards, 300, 250. "Steady," Campbell commands. "Steady." Some of the Highlanders begin to edge forward, eager to close with the enemy. Campbell's voice cracks like a whip. 93rd, damn all, that eagerness. The men freeze. The Russians come on, 200 yards now. The Highlanders can smell the horses, hear the jingle of harness, the grunting of the animals. "Fire!" The first volley crashes out, a wall of smoke and lead. Russian horses scream and tumble. Riders are thrown. The charge wavers, but does not stop. "Reload! Fire!" A second volley tears into the Russian ranks. This time, the cavalry breaks. They wheel away, unable to face the murderous accuracy of the Minier rifles. The Highlanders stand their ground, a thin red streak tipped with steel, unbroken and unbowed. A correspondent for the Times, William Howard Russell, watches from the heights above. He will later write of that thin red streak topped with a line of steel. The phrase will be shortened, misquoted, transformed into legend. The thin red line. It will come to symbolize British steadfastness, the refusal to yield against impossible odds. But the battle is far from over. As the Russian cavalry regroups from their repulse at Kadikoy, a larger force of some 3,000 horsemen begins moving across the North Valley. Their objective is unclear, perhaps to reinforce the attack on Balaclava, perhaps to threaten the British siege lines. Whatever their intention, they present an irresistible target. Brigadier General James Scarlett commands the Heavy Brigade, approximately 800 men in 5 regiments, the Scots Greys, the Inniskilling Dragoons, and 3 regiments of Dragoon Guards. These are big men on big horses, trained for shock action, for the thunderous collision of mounted combat. Scarlett sees the Russian cavalry moving across his front. He has seconds to make a decision. The Russians outnumber him nearly 4 to 1. They hold the high ground. Every principle of cavalry tactics says he should wait, should maneuver, should seek advantage. Scarlett orders the charge. Scarlett turns to his aide-de-camp, Lieutenant Alexander Elliot, as the Russian mass comes into view.
"So they must have 3,000 sabres. Perhaps we should wait for support?"
Wait? Elliot, look at them. They've stopped moving. They're as surprised to see us as we are to see them. If we give them time to think, they'll roll right over us. No. We go now, we go hard, and we go straight through them.
"The men will follow you anywhere, sir."
Then let's give them somewhere worth going. Sound the charge.
What happens next defies military logic. The Heavy Brigade, numbering barely 300 in the first line, charges uphill into a stationary mass of Russian cavalry. The Russians, inexplicably, do not countercharge. They sit motionless, perhaps stunned by the audacity of the attack, perhaps waiting for orders that never come. The British crash into the Russian line like a hammer into glass. The impact is tremendous. Horses collide, sabers flash, men scream. The noise is indescribable, a cacophony of steel on steel, the shriek of wounded horses, the grunting and cursing of men locked in hand-to-hand combat. Scarlet himself plunges into the melee, his sword rising and falling. He is 55 years old, portly, nearsighted, and utterly fearless. He fights like a man possessed, hacking his way through the Russian ranks, his red coat soon splattered with blood. Beside him, Lieutenant Elliot takes a savage cut across the back of his head, the first of 14 saber wounds he will receive before the day is done. The first squadron is swallowed by the Russian mass. For a moment, it seems they must be overwhelmed. Then the second squadron hits, then the third. The Scots graze, their grey horses making them unmistakable, carve a path through the enemy. The Inniskillings, Irish to a man, fight with savage fury. The Russians begin to waver. Incredibly, impossibly, they begin to give ground. The sheer ferocity of the British attack has unnerved them. Within 8 minutes, the Russian cavalry is in full retreat, streaming back across the valley, leaving hundreds of dead and wounded behind. The Heavy Brigade has won one of the most remarkable cavalry victories in history. They have charged uphill, outnumbered 4-1, and routed their enemy. Casualties are astonishingly light, fewer than 80 men killed and wounded. Scarlet himself receives 5 saber cuts and a dented helmet, but survives. Elliot, bleeding from over a dozen wounds, will recover to paint the E, seen years later. On the heights above, Lord Raglan watches with satisfaction. The morning has been difficult, but the situation is stabilizing. The Ottomans have lost the redoubts, but their sacrifice bought time. The Russian advance has been stopped. Now, Raglan believes, is the moment to counterattack, to recapture the lost positions, to drive the Russians from the field entirely. He issues an order that will live in infamy. The problem begins with perspective. From his position on the Sapune Heights, Lord Raglan can see Russian artillery teams preparing to remove the naval guns captured from the Ottoman redoubts. These guns are valuable. More importantly, their loss would be a propaganda victory for the Russians, proof that they had driven the Allies from their positions. Raglan wants those guns recaptured. He dictates an order to his Quartermaster General, Richard Eyre. The order reads, Lord Raglan wishes the cavalry to advance rapidly to the front, follow the enemy, and try to prevent the enemy carrying away the guns. Troop of horse artillery may accompany. French cavalry is on your left. Immediate. The order is vague. Dangerously vague. Which guns? Which enemy? Which front? From Raglan's elevated position, the answers are obvious. He can see the redoubts. He can see the Russians removing the guns. He can see exactly what he wants the cavalry to do. But down in the valley, the cavalry commander, Lord Lucan, can see none of this. The causeway heights block his view of the redoubts. The only guns visible to him are the Russian battery at the far end of the North Valley, a mile and a quarter away, flanked by artillery on both ridges. Surely, Lucan thinks, Raglan cannot mean those guns. Surely no sane commander would order a cavalry charge directly into the mouths of a dozen cannons. The order is carried by Captain Lewis Nolan, a passionate cavalry officer who has spent years studying mounted warfare. Nolan is brilliant, arrogant, and contemptuous of Lucan, who he considers an incompetent amateur. The animosity between them is well known throughout the army. Lucan reads the order, his face reddening with confusion and anger. Nolan sits impatiently on his horse.
This order is utterly impractical. Attack what guns? Where? There are guns everywhere. The only guns I can see are at the end of the valley, and attacking those would be suicide.
Lord Raglan's orders are that the cavalry should attack immediately.
Attack what? What guns?
Nolan's patience snaps. He flings out his arm in a gesture that will be debated for centuries, pointing vaguely down the valley.
There, my lord, is your enemy. There are your guns.
What did Nolan mean? Was he pointing at the redoubts, hidden from Lucan's view? Or was he pointing at the Russian battery at the valley's end? Historians have argued for nearly 2 centuries. Nolan himself cannot clarify. He will be dead within minutes. Lucan, furious but bound by military discipline, passes the order to Lord Cardigan, commander of the Light Brigade. The two men despise each other. They are brothers-in-law, their relationship poisoned by years of family feuds and professional jealousy. Their communication is minimal, hostile, and utterly inadequate for the situation. Cardigan reads the order. He looks down the valley at the Russian guns. He knows this is madness. He says so. "Certainly, sir," he replies to Lucan, "but allow me to point out to you that the Russians have a battery in the valley in our front, and batteries and riflemen on each flank." Lucan's response is cold. "I know it, but Lord Raglan will have it. We have no choice but to obey." Cardigan salutes. He turns his horse to face his brigade. 673 men in 5 regiments, the 4th Light Dragoons, the 8th Hussars, the 11th Hussars, the 13th Light Dragoons, and the 17th Lancers. They are the elite of the British cavalry, magnificently trained, superbly mounted, utterly doomed. The time is approximately 11:10 in the morning. The Light Brigade forms up in 2 lines, with the 13th Light Dragoons and 17th Lancers in front, the remaining regiments behind. The valley stretches before them, 1.25 miles of open ground. The Russian guns wait at the far end. More guns line the Fedyukin heights to the left. Still more guns, plus infantry and dismounted cavalry, occupy the causeway heights to the right. It is a killing ground. Everyone knows it. Lord Cardigan takes his position at the head of the brigade, some 2 horse lengths ahead of the front line. He is 57 years old, vain, arrogant, and utterly fearless. Whatever his faults as a commander, and they are many, no one has ever questioned his personal courage. He will lead from the front, as a cavalry officer should. The bugle sounds, walk, march, trot. The brigade moves forward, maintaining perfect formation, as if on parade. The Russians watch in disbelief. Surely this cannot be a real attack. Surely the British will wheel away, will demonstrate, will do anything other than ride directly into the crossfire. They do not wheel away. Captain Nolan, who's attached himself to the charge, suddenly gallops ahead of the formation. He waves his sword. He shouts something, his words lost in the growing thunder of hooves. Some witnesses believe he realized the terrible mistake, that he was trying to redirect the charge toward the redoubts. Others think he was simply overcome with excitement, eager to lead the attack. We will never know. A Russian shell explodes nearby. A fragment of shrapnel tears through Nolan's chest, destroying his heart. His sword arm freezes, locked in its final gesture. His horse, unguided, carries his corpse forward for several seconds before veering away. The first casualty of the charge is the man who delivered the order. The Russian guns open fire. The sound is apocalyptic. Cannons roar from 3 directions. Shells burst overhead, showering the formation with shrapnel. Round shot tears through the ranks, killing men and horses, leaving bloody gaps in the line. The smell of gunpowder is overwhelming, a thick, acrid fog that burns the eyes and throat. The ground shakes with each explosion. The Light Brigade does not stop. They do not waver. They close ranks over their fallen comrades and continue forward. Private James Whiteman of the 17th Lancers later described the experience. The noise was so tremendous that individual explosions blurred into a continuous roar. Men and horses fell constantly, tumbling in sprays of blood and dust. The survivors had to guide their mounts around the bodies, maintaining formation even as the formation disintegrated around them. The pace increases. Trot becomes canter. Canter becomes gallop. The brigade is racing now, desperate to close the distance, to reach the guns before the guns destroy them all. Cardigan remains at the front, his horse stretching into a full gallop. He does not look back. He does not check on his men. He simply rides, straight and true, toward the Russian battery. The final 200 yards are the worst. The Russian gunners switch to canister, turning their cannons into giant shotguns. Each blast sends hundreds of iron balls screaming into the charging cavalry. Men are torn apart. Horses collapse in mid-stride. The noise, the smoke, the chaos are indescribable. And then, impossibly, the Light Brigade reaches the guns. In the chaos of the melee at the guns, Sergeant Major George Loy Smith of the 11th Hussars finds himself beside a young cornet, barely 18 years old, whose horse has been shot from under him.
Sergeant Major, my horse is dead. What do I do?
Grab a Russian horse, sir. There's plenty about. And keep your sword up. There's Cossacks coming.
I can't see anything through the smoke.
Then swing at anything that isn't wearing red, sir. Now move, before they reorganize.
The survivors of the charge crash into the Russian battery. For a few chaotic minutes, they have their revenge. Gunners are cut down at their pieces. Horses trample the wounded. Sabres rise and fall in the smoke and confusion. The Light Brigade, or what remains of it, has achieved the impossible. They have reached the guns, but they cannot hold them. Russian cavalry, 1,000 strong, begins to close in from all sides. The Cossacks, held in reserve, now sweep forward. The survivors of the charge are exhausted, their horses blown, their numbers catastrophically reduced. They have no choice but to retreat. The ride back is as terrible as the ride in. The same guns that savaged them on the way down now savage them again. Men who survive the charge are killed in the retreat. Riderless horses gallop alongside the survivors, adding to the confusion. The smoke is so thick that men cannot see more than a few yards in any direction. Lord Cardigan, remarkably, survives without a scratch. He rides back up the valley alone, having somehow passed through the entire gauntlet unharmed. He will later be criticized for not rallying his men, for not organizing the retreat, for thinking only of himself. The criticism is probably unfair. In the chaos of the moment, there was nothing to rally, nothing to organize. The Light Brigade had ceased to exist as a coherent unit. The charge lasted approximately 20 minutes. In that time, the Light Brigade suffered casualties of nearly 40%. Of the 673 men who began the charge, 118 were killed, 127 were wounded, and some 60 were taken prisoner. 375 horses were killed. The survivors straggle back to the British lines in small groups, many of them wounded, all of them in shock. They are met with stunned silence. Officers who watched the charge from the heights cannot believe anyone survived at all. Lord Raglan is furious. He confronts Lucan, demanding to know why the Light Brigade charged the wrong guns. Lucan, equally furious, insists he followed orders exactly as given. The argument will continue for years, destroying reputations, ending careers, poisoning relationships. No one will ever accept responsibility for the disaster. The French General Pierre Bosquet, watching from the heights, delivers the most famous verdict on the charge. His words, translated loosely, capture the horror and the admiration that the charge inspired. It is magnificent, but it is not war. It is madness. If you appreciate stories like this, tales of courage and catastrophe, of human beings pushed to their absolute limits, then you understand why history matters. These were real men with real families, real hopes, real fears. They rode into that valley knowing they would probably die, and they went anyway. Their story deserves to be told, to be remembered, to be shared. If you want more content like this, more deep dives into the moments that shaped our world, consider subscribing to Not Nostalgic History. We don't just tell you what happened. We put you there, in the smoke and the chaos, in the minds of the people who lived it. Hit that subscribe button, ring the notification bell, and join us as we explore the past in all its terrible, magnificent complexity. Now, back to Balaclava. The Battle of Balaclava did not end with the charge of the Light Brigade, but the charge overshadowed everything else. In the days and weeks that followed, the British Army struggled to process what had happened. Letters home described the horror in terms that the Victorian public had never encountered. The romantic image of cavalry warfare, of gallant charges and glorious victories, was shattered forever. The wounded faced a nightmare of their own. Medical facilities were utterly inadequate. The hospital at Scutari, across the Black Sea in Turkey, was a death trap of disease and neglect. It would take the arrival of Florence Nightingale and her nurses to begin reforming the system, but that reform came too late for many of the men wounded at Balaclava. The families of the dead received official notifications weeks or months after the battle. Many learned of their losses through newspaper reports before any official word arrived. The Times correspondent William Howard Russell, whose dispatches brought the reality of the war home to British readers, became both celebrated and reviled. His honest reporting exposed the incompetence of the military leadership, but it also caused immense pain to families who read of their loved ones' deaths in graphic detail. The survivors carried their trauma for the rest of their lives. Many suffered what we would now recognize as post-traumatic stress disorder. They had nightmares. They flinched at loud noises. They could not speak of what they had seen without breaking down. Victorian society had no framework for understanding such suffering. Men were expected to be stoic, to carry on, to bury their pain. Many did. Many could not. In the aftermath of the battle, the search for scapegoats began immediately. Lord Raglan blamed Lord Lucan for misinterpreting the order. Lucan blamed Captain Nolan for his ambiguous gesture and Lord Raglan for his vague wording. Cardigan blamed everyone except himself, insisting that he had followed orders exactly and that his personal conduct had been beyond reproach. The British public, initially shocked by the disaster, gradually transformed it into a story of heroism. The incompetence of the commanders was acknowledged, but the courage of the men who charged became the dominant narrative. Alfred, Lord Tennyson, published his poem, The Charge of the Light Brigade, just weeks after the battle. Its rhythmic verses, celebrating the bravery of the 600, became one of the most famous poems in the English language. Theirs not to reason why, theirs but to do and die. The line captured something essential about the Victorian military. Ethos, the absolute obedience expected of soldiers, the willingness to follow orders even unto death. It was both a celebration and a critique, though most readers focused on the celebration. The poem ensured that the charge of the Light Brigade would never be forgotten. But it also simplified the story, reducing a complex disaster to a tale of noble sacrifice. The questions of why the charge happened, of who was responsible, of what lessons should be learned, were buried beneath the poetry. The Ottoman contribution to the Battle of Balaclava has been largely forgotten, overshadowed by the drama of the cavalry charges. Yet without those 90 minutes bought by Turkish blood at Redoubt No. 1, the Russians might have swept through to Balaclava before any defense could be organized. The thin red line, the heavy brigade, the light brigade, all of these iconic moments were made possible by men whose sacrifice was repaid with scorn. The Tunisian soldiers who held the redoubts were far from home, fighting in a war they did not choose, for allies who did not respect them. They were poorly fed, poorly equipped, and poorly led. And yet they stood their ground for an hour and a half against overwhelming odds, suffering over 30% casualties before they finally broke. By any objective measure, their defense was heroic. But history, as always, was written by those with the loudest voices, not those who bled the most. British accounts of the battle dismissed the Ottoman troops as cowards who fled at the first sign of danger. This narrative served a purpose. It deflected blame from British commanders who had failed to reinforce the redoubts, who had left their allies to die alone. It was easier to blame the Turks than to admit that the entire defensive scheme had been flawed from the start. The truth is that the Ottoman soldiers at Balaclava performed exactly as could be expected of any troops in their situation. They were outnumbered, outgunned, and abandoned. They fought until fighting was no longer possible, and then they retreated. There is no shame in that. The shame belongs to those who left them to their fate and then blamed them for the consequences. The Crimean War continued for another 2 years after Balaclava. Sevastopol finally fell in September of 1855, after a brutal siege that cost tens of thousands of lives on both sides. The war ended with the Treaty of Paris in March of 1856, a diplomatic settlement that resolved little and satisfied no one. The British Army emerged from the war with its reputation in tatters. The incompetence revealed at Balaclava and throughout the campaign led to demands for reform. The purchase system, which allowed wealthy men to buy commissions regardless of ability, was eventually abolished. Medical and logistical systems were overhauled. The lessons of Crimea, paid for in blood, slowly transformed the British military. But some lessons were never learned. The class divisions that had contributed to the disaster at Balaclava persisted for decades. The rigid hierarchy that prevented Lucan from questioning Raglan's order, that made Nolan's contempt for his superiors so dangerous, remained largely intact. It would take the even greater catastrophe of the First World War to finally break the old system. Today, the charge of the Light Brigade remains one of the most famous military actions in history. It has been depicted in paintings, films, and countless books. The phrase, "into the valley of death," has entered common usage, a shorthand for any doomed enterprise undertaken with courage and futility. The battlefield itself is now part of Ukraine, the site of renewed conflict in the 21st century. The valley where the Light Brigade charged has seen war again, a reminder that the lessons of history are never fully learned, that each generation must confront its own follies and pay its own price. But perhaps the most enduring legacy of Balaclava is the question it forces us to ask. What do we owe to those who follow orders they know are wrong? The men of the Light Brigade were not fools. They knew the charge was suicidal. They went anyway because they were soldiers, because they trusted their commanders, because they believed in duty and honor and the regiment. Their obedience killed them. Was that obedience admirable or tragic? Was it courage or foolishness? The answer, perhaps, is that it was all of these things at once. The charge of the Light Brigade was a disaster born of miscommunication, ego, and systemic failure. It was also an act of extraordinary bravery by ordinary men who did their duty in impossible circumstances. The valley is quiet now. The guns are silent. The horses are gone. Only the wind moves across the grass, where 673 men rode to glory and death on a cold October morning in 1854. They were cavalrymen, the finest in the world, trained for a kind of warfare that was already becoming obsolete. They charged into the future, into the age of industrial killing, and the future destroyed them. But they did not flinch. They did not break. They rode on into the smoke and the fire, into the valley of death, into history. We remember them not because they won, but because they went. We remember them because their courage, however misguided, however futile, speaks to something deep in the human spirit. We remember them because, in the end, they were just men, ordinary men, who did an extraordinary thing. We should also remember those who made their stand possible. The Ottoman soldiers who held the redoubts, buying time with their lives. The Highlanders who stood in their thin red line. The heavy brigade who charged uphill into impossible odds. Balaclava was not just the story of the Light Brigade. It was the story of all who fought there, allies and enemies alike, bound together in the terrible crucible of war. The charge of the Light Brigade was a tragedy. It was also, in its terrible way, a triumph. Not a triumph of arms, but a triumph of will, of discipline, of the refusal to surrender, even when surrender was the only sane option. Into the valley of death rode the 600. Most of them never came back. But their story lives on, a warning and an inspiration, a reminder of what human beings are capable of, for good and for ill. This was the Battle of Balaclava. This was the charge of the Light Brigade. This was the day that courage and catastrophe became inseparable, forever written in blood on the field